Let's bring in Dan Perry. He's an international affairs analyst and former Europe editor for the Associated Press. Dan, thank you so much for joining us. Let's talk about the trips now in Israel that these diplomats are making. How important is Israel for the EU in terms of energy? It's looking to shift from Russian gas, but how much gas can Israel actually supply to them?
Well, Israel's assumed natural gas reserves are over 1,000 billion cubic meters, possibly 1,500 billion cubic meters. Europe, I believe, consumes annually about a third of that. So Israel's not inconsequential at all. Russia provides Europe with between a third and half of its natural gas needs. So I think we're talking about 200 billion cubic meters. Israel could provide a bit of that, could provide a not insubstantial bit of that. The question is how. There are three options to deliver this natural gas to Europe. One would go through Egypt, which would liquefy it and then send it on tankers. That's the easiest way. But it would involve dependence on Egypt, not just Israel, and they're part of Europe. They may not be totally comfortable with that. The others would involve pipelines going either through Turkey, which is looking more possible now than it was a year ago because of Turkey's own needs, which have led to a thaw in its relations with Israel. But Turkey's unstable. The third option is building a pipeline through Cyprus and Greece. That's unbelievably expensive. It'll take a long time. And I believe that may be the reason why Mario Draghi is here, because Israel wants Italy to sign on to that project as well and to guarantee that it will buy that natural gas in the long term. So it could be a sort of a complex deal involving not just the EU, but guarantees from Italy.
So what other solutions can Israel give the EU? We've been hearing about increasing interest of weaponry by European countries, and they're looking to upgrade their defense capabilities since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So what else can Israel really provide for them?
Oh, Israel has world-beating technology in AI and drones and all manner of weapons systems. Israel's one of the world's leading weapons exporters, but even more than this, one of the world's leading exporters, maybe one of the top two or three of high-tech weaponry. And I believe Europe is on the cusp of some verge of a realignment in more than one way. For decades now, they have been a little cavalier about the idea of defense, and they have assumed that Russia, the inheritor of the Soviet Union, is no longer the potential combatant enemy that the Soviet Union was. They're no longer thinking that because of what has happened in Ukraine and the general metamorphosis of Putin from a grudging Democrat to an autocrat to ultimately today a somewhat demonic dictator who's not above threatening use of nuclear arms. So Europe needs to upgrade its defense in more than one way. Manpower, funding, technology, and in general, a diplomatic wherewithal that always pushes the advancement of weapon systems and of the development of defense and military capability. And more than this, I think there's something in human nature that sort of needs a friend that has disappointed us. And Israel for Europe played that role for many, many years because of its misadventures in the West Bank and Gaza. I think it's being supplanted by Russia. And that obviously bodes well for Israel. Europe is looking to get closer to Israel in more than one way because of all this.
So let's talk a little bit now about Russia. How will they view this? One, if Israel chooses to supply gas to Europe instead of them, and two, should they choose to provide weapons to those EU countries as well?
Russia will be unhappy, but we have many, many moving parts here. Israel can't forever be cowed by the fear of Russian unhappiness. In the end, the main Russian lever on Israel is its acquiescence to Israel's Air Force activities in Syrian airspace. And that obviously has caused Israel to be very cautious in how it dealt with the Ukraine war, and it has not fully joined the sanctions, hardly at all. Really, it has been very muted in its criticism of Russia. For a while, it tried to cover that with the appearance of a diplomatic effort, which requires even-handedness, but I think that is more or less dissipated, and it'll have to make a choice whether the Russian ability to give it freedom of operation in Syrian airspace is worth what it loses, the opportunity cost that it faces elsewhere with the Americans and with the Europeans.
Talk to us a little bit about this gas deal that Israel is trying to get Italy on. For those who are unfamiliar, talk to us a little bit about Israel's plan.
Well, Israel has always envisioned its natural gas resources, which has developed over the past 10 to 15 years, and which are an amazing windfall for Israel, as something that is partly, if not muchly, destined for export. Export is complicated because you either build pipelines or you must liquefy the gas and send it on ships. I think the interesting thing here is that liquefaction is the path of least resistance. And if they go that path, and if it's accelerated by the dire European need, that will go through Egypt, because Egypt has liquefaction facilities and Israel does not. And that may, as a perhaps unintended consequence of Putin's war on Ukraine, serve to bring Israel and Egypt closer together, maybe the closest that they've been in 40 some years of peace. And that's a quite remarkable thing. Also, Europe has a choice to make. They have recently pretty much banned the import of Russian oil, but they haven't yet banned Russian natural gas. I think from this meeting today, from meetings like this in coming days and weeks, may arise the European willingness to bite the bullet and to really cut off Russian natural gas if they are able to feel confident that an alternative comes from Israel, and also possibly, by the way, from the Gulf as well. There could be a more complex deal involving natural gas powers in the Persian Gulf, no less than Israel and Egypt.
Dan, I also want to ask you, what can Italy expect in return, other than just gas, for signing on to this plan that Israel wants? What's really in it for them?
Well, the Italian government is about as unstable as Israel's government, so I think they need to show some wins. Israel's not going to give Italy financial aid, but I think Italy has, like all of Europe, has a lot to gain from collaboration with Israel. I consider a statistic that very few people know. In terms of foreign investment coming into Israeli technology, either through IPOs or through direct investment through venture capital firms, Israel, with about 10 million people, in 2021 brought in pretty close to half the sum of the entire European Union, with 440 million people, so about 20 times per capita. Israel is in many ways a technological and scientific superpower, and I think Italy, which has seen its per capita GDP fall by about a third, I think, relative to Israel's in the past 20 years, has a lot to benefit from closer ties to Israel.
Dan Perry, an international affairs analyst. You're going to stay with us for the rest of the broadcast. We're going to bring you back in as soon as that presser happens. Thank you for your insight.